Hey, everybody. I hope and pray that you're doing well today as we go to our word from the word. And today, that word is pain. Pain. And I know, you're probably thinking, man, a lot of people are watching this Monday morning, and you think pain is not the word that I wanted to wake up to today. But here's the thing I think we really need to understand that God can use pain, and I don't look at it as a cruel thing, like He's using pain in that sense, but that there are times when He does allow pain to enter our lives to teach us a lesson. I mean, look, you think about discipline. Discipline is painful. Physically painful, spiritually painful, emotionally painful. But in the end, we're better off because of it. But here, as we see in Ezekiel chapter 24. This is kind of the end of the first half of Ezekiel, and he's getting ready to change gears. His ministry is going to change a little bit after this chapter. But the message as we have here, according to Scripture, backed up in several places in Scripture, even in 2 Kings and in a couple places in Jeremiah, that the message of chapter 24 came to him on January 15th, 588 BC. Now you say, now why is that important? Well, it's when the siege began on Jerusalem. And the Jewish people had several feasts, and they kept track of everything as it happened to Jerusalem and the temple. And so as the first half of this chapter deals with the siege on Jerusalem, the second half deals with the Jewish response and how they were going to feel. And there's something here I always tell you, I've always been encouraging you to read the whole chapter along with us. But here the first half is really dealing with them like being in a boiling pot. And not only was he going to destroy and cook everything in it, but that he was going to destroy the pot as well. And it was just talking about the whole sin of Jerusalem and all the judgment that was coming. But I do want us to jump in right there in the middle. And I want us to see it's some very sad words. And it's upsetting to read. But in Ezekiel chapter 24, starting in verse 15, it says, "Also the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, behold, I take away from you the desire of your eyes with one stroke. Yet you shall neither mourn nor weep, nor shall your tears run down. Sigh in silence. Make no mourning for the dead. Bind your turban on your head, and put your sandals on your feet. Do not cover your lips, and do not eat man's bread of sorrow. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and at evening my wife died. And the next morning I did as I was commanded." Now, here's, and I'll be honest with you. The first time that I was reading through this, and I remember thinking, man, here he is doing the work of God, and to see that, man, he's going to be struggling. He's here been so faithful and so obedient to God, and now we see that his wife is going to die. And if you're like me, the first question is what? Why? Why, God? Why? That would be naturally for all of us, and especially, I want to be very careful with those of you who have maybe recently lost a loved one, and you're saying, you might even be tempted to believe that, no, see, this is proving that God is a cruel God, and we've got to be really careful that we don't jump to those conclusions. Because let's also remember take a step back and look at it from God's perspective. And we don't know. Ezekiel's wife could have already been sick for some time. We don't know, and that would be speculation there. But regardless, God knew. Scripture tells us that our days are numbered, right? And so God already knew the day that her number was up, the day that she was going to breathe her last. And so since he already knew that, he could have used this time and appointed this time to be a moment where he could use that. He could use that painful experience that Ezekiel was having, and he could make Ezekiel have to handle it in a certain way. But he could use it all together for good. Use it to be a picture of how the Jewish people were going to respond. And see, this is already, if you're hearing in that, is Romans 8:28. We know that God works all things together for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. It's easy to say, it's somewhat easy to believe, but it's really hard to understand. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, we know that he's working it together for good, and we believe that. But then understanding what the good is, sometimes we just don't know what that good is. And sometimes I think we won't know until we get to heaven. And I'm okay with that. But here's the thing. Let's get back into our passage. It's easy to get into a lot of other discussions with this, but God was using Ezekiel as an example of how the Jewish people were going to respond. See, as all this destruction is coming and the siege was beginning, and that when they got the word that everything had began to fall apart and that Jerusalem had fallen, and much more important to them, the temple had fallen. Now, we already talked about the way they defiled the temple, but they still held it in such esteem that they thought nothing could happen, and this was like their prized possession. Why they still treated it like junk, I don't know. But because of sin is what that was. But to think about it, as he said, if you heard, he said that he was going to take what Ezekiel, basically what he had his eyes focused on, the love of his eyes. And that was his wife. And he was saying, for the same way, the Jewish people, the love of their eyes was for their temple. So God was going to make them have to respond the same way Ezekiel was responding to his wife's death. He couldn't grieve in the normal ways. He couldn't even eat. I mean, we do meal trains around here of something like that, to take care of people in their difficult times. And he's like, no, you're not going to eat the food they're going to bring. You're not going to dress any different. You're not going to act any different. If you're going to cry, if you're going to sigh, and you're going to do it quietly, you're going to groan in your own personal time. And you know how difficult this must have been. Some of you have been through loss such as this, and so you understand how difficult this could be. And for others of us that you never lost anybody that close, so we'd have a difficult time understanding it. But now the people of Jerusalem, the exiles, they were going to look at this a different way. See, they were going to, as they see Ezekiel's wife die, and then they ask, further on after this, they ask, well, why are you not mourning? Why are you acting like this, Ezekiel? And he's saying, look, this is the message from the Lord, that you're going to respond the same way. Because in that moment that you hear that everything that God said was going to happen, happens. And even Ezekiel saying, look, everything that I've told you that God said, everything, when that comes true, in that moment, you're not going to cry out loud. You're not going to weep out loud. You're not going to, take off your shoes and change your clothes and all these things that were customary for them. You're not going to do any of those things. You know why? Because you're going to understand it was all because of you. Now, Ezekiel's wife didn't die because of Ezekiel, but he was using this as an example to say, look, the way that you're grieving, those people are going to grieve over the temple and over Jerusalem, but they're not going to be able to grieve right because they're going to know that it's because of them. They're going to know that God means business. And as he is constantly saying, they're going to know that the Lord, he is God. And some, you can even look, there's a couple dates even going with this. I told you that this message originally came January 15th of 588 BC. Well, on August 14th of 586 BC, the Babylonians burned the temple. But see, they didn't have social media and live TV like we have now. So it took about 5 months before he got the word. And Ezekiel got the message on January 8th, 585 BC. Got the message of this happening. And then if you remember from earlier on in Ezekiel, that Ezekiel was, that God told him he was going to be mute. He was going to be silent except when God told him to speak. Well, one of the signs that all these things had come true is that after he got the message that Jerusalem had fallen, then the next day he wakes up and he can speak freely anytime he desires. And it's the end of his ministry that he was doing that way. He's going to change, and he's going to start having ministry to the Gentile nations next. But I was reading in a couple commentaries, and this is kind of where we're going to bring it all back around to us, because I know some of you sitting there thinking, okay, well, still, what does this have to do with me? Well, if you remember Wednesday, we talked about that we needed gap fillers. We needed those that were willing to stand in the gap. And one commentator that I was reading, it even called this for Ezekiel, said that he showed great gapmanship. And I love that, gapmanship, that he was willing to stand in the gap and be used in any way for God, even if it meant pain. Anything that would help God reach his people. Now, the application for you and I today, there's two things that I want to point out. The first is this. Don't believe that believers are immune to pain and suffering. And I know most of you are like, well, no, I know that. But don't get sucked into the thought that, well, you must be doing something wrong. Now, there is sin, and there are consequences for sin. But like Job was righteous, but then still had to suffer. So don't automatically believe that the believer is immune to pain and suffering. In fact, we know that we face it as well. But here's the key that I want to leave you with today. Don't assume and don't believe that pain keeps us from obedience. I'm going to read verse 18 again, because he said, "So I spoke to the people in the morning, and at evening my wife died. And the next morning I did as I was commanded." See, how many of us could say that even in the deepest, darkest valleys of our lives, that we still got up and did what God told us to do? See, to me, the pain is worthless if we don't learn from it and we don't continue to do what God's called us to do. So I don't know what pain you might be facing today. But don't look at it as something strange and say, well, I'm a believer, I shouldn't be in pain. And we know that's contrary to Scripture. But don't for a second believe the lie that just because you're in pain today, that God doesn't still call us to obedience. God bless you. I hope and pray you have a great, great day.